To the aces of the Luftwaffe, the self-proclaimed masters of the European sky, it was a joke, a laughable insult to aviation itself. When the American P-47 Thunderbolt first lumbered into view over the skies of occupied France in the spring of 1943, battle-hardened German pilots, men who had shot down Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Soviet Yaks by the dozen, couldn't help but burst into laughter at its clumsy, grotesquely bloated frame. They called it the fliegende Milchflasche, the flying milk bottle. But as one grizzled German ace would later admit, his voice heavy with bitter regret, we laughed. We laughed until our sides hurt. We made a terrible, terrible mistake. Picture this. Spring 1943. The European theater is a cauldron of violence. The air war has become a savage, unforgiving contest of machinery and will. German fighter pilots, the cream of the Luftwaffe, sit in their ready rooms at forward air bases scattered across France, Belgium, and Holland. They smoke, they play cards, they joke with the easy confidence of men who have owned the sky for nearly 4 years. They have faced the best Britain could throw at them, the elegant Supermarine Spitfire with its elliptical wings, the rugged Hawker Hurricane, even the early American aircraft that arrived with such fanfare but disappointed in combat. And then, intelligence reports start filtering down from Luftwaffe High Command. A new American fighter is entering service. It's big, really big. When the first reconnaissance photos are pinned to briefing room walls, the reaction is immediate, raucous laughter. This can't be serious. This thing is enormous. It looks pregnant. It looks like someone inflated a fighter plane with an air compressor until it was ready to burst. The specifications are even more absurd. The American P-47 Thunderbolt weighs 8 tons fully loaded. 8 tons! To put that in perspective, the German pilots are flying the magnificent Focke-Wulf FW-190, a masterpiece of aviation engineering that weighs barely 4.5 tons when combat ready. The new American monster weighs nearly double. It's not a fighter, they joke. It's a flying bathtub. It's a truck with wings. One Luftwaffe pilot, seeing it for the first time through his gun sight, reportedly radioed back to his base, "I'm looking at what appears to be a pregnant cow attempting to fly. Request confirmation I haven't gone insane." The Germans, with their engineering precision and their years of combat experience, figured this airborne juggernaut would be slow, clumsy, and easy kill, proof positive of what they saw as crude, unsophisticated American engineering philosophy. Bigger is better, right? Just throw more metal at the problem. How very American. How very predictable. How very wrong. That laughter, that absolute certainty in their own superiority, would soon die, choked off in a storm of steel and fire, as they discovered that the flying milk bottle was filled with 8 50-caliber machine guns that could saw a fighter plane in half, a revolutionary engine that owned the high altitudes like a god claiming his throne, and a toughness that was almost supernatural, almost impossible to believe even when you saw it with your own eyes. They laughed at it. They laughed at it right up until the moment it started systematically, methodically, ruthlessly wiping them from the sky. To understand the P-47 story, you need to understand the air war in early 1943. It was a lethal chess match played at 300 miles per hour, where one mistake meant death, and the German Luftwaffe were the undisputed Grand Masters. By this point in the war, German fighter pilots had accumulated years of combat experience. They'd fought over Poland, France, Britain, North Africa, and the endless, blood-soaked skies of the Eastern Front. They'd developed tactics that were devastatingly effective. They understood energy management, the geometry of angles and speed, the psychology of combat. They knew when to attack, when to break off, how to use the sun, the clouds, the altitude advantage. Their fighters were finely honed blades, instruments of precision and speed that had dominated the skies for years. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, with its elegant lines and powerful Daimler-Benz engine, was a proven killer, with hundreds of Allied aircraft to its credit. The newer Focke-Wulf FW-190, introduced in 1941, had shocked the RAF with its combination of firepower, speed, and roll rate. German pilots had swagger, and they'd earned it through blood and victory. Into this arena of deadly artists came the American challenger, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. And on first glance, by first impression, by every conventional measure of what made a great fighter aircraft, it looked like a total, complete, unmitigated bust. It wasn't just the enemy who was skeptical. It wasn't just German pilots laughing in their mess halls. American pilots, young men fresh out of flight school, eager to prove themselves, burning with patriotic fervor, took one look at the P-47 and were absolutely aghast. The disappointment was crushing. This was supposed to be their weapon, their tool of war, the machine that would carry them into combat and hopefully carry them home. And it was this? The specifications are even more absurd. The American P-47 Thunderbolt weighs 8 tons fully loaded. 8 tons! To put that in perspective, the German pilots are flying the magnificent Focke-Wulf FW-190, a masterpiece of aviation engineering that weighs barely 4.5 tons when combat ready. The new American monster weighs nearly double. It's not a fighter, they joke. It's a flying bathtub. It's a truck with wings. One Luftwaffe pilot, seeing it for the first time through his gun sight, reportedly radioed back to his base, "I'm looking at what appears to be a pregnant cow attempting to fly. Request confirmation I haven't gone insane." The Germans, with their engineering precision and their years of combat experience, figured this airborne juggernaut would be slow, clumsy, an easy kill, proof positive of what they saw as crude, unsophisticated American engineering philosophy. Bigger is better, right? Just throw more metal at the problem. How very American. How very predictable. How very wrong. That laughter, that absolute certainty in their own superiority, would soon die, choked off in a storm of steel and fire, as they discovered that the flying milk bottle was filled with 8 50 caliber machine guns that could saw a fighter plane in half, a revolutionary engine that owned the high altitudes like a god claiming his throne, and a toughness that was almost supernatural, almost impossible to believe even when you saw it with your own eyes. They laughed at it. They laughed at it right up until the moment it started systematically, methodically, ruthlessly wiping them from the sky. Pilots nicknamed it the Jug, and not affectionately. The name came from its stubby, jug-shaped profile, like the common milk jugs that sat on kitchen tables back home. Some said it stood for juggernaut, but that came later, much later, after the plane had proven itself. In those early days, jug was just a polite way of saying, "This plane looks ridiculous." But to understand why the P-47 looked the way it did, you have to go back to its origins, to the mind of one brilliant, unconventional engineer who saw the future of air combat with crystal clarity. The plane's designer was a Georgian immigrant named Alexander Kartveli, a man with thick-rimmed glasses, a heavy accent, and a reputation for thinking outside the box, then throwing the box away entirely. Born in Tiflis, Georgia in 1996, Kartveli had studied aviation in Paris before immigrating to the United States in 1927. He joined Seversky Aircraft Corporation, which later became Republic Aviation, and quickly established himself as a visionary with little patience for conventional wisdom. In 1940, with war raging across Europe and America's entry looking increasingly inevitable, the U.S. Army Air Corps came to Republic with a challenge: create a new interceptor that could take on the Luftwaffe's best fighters and win. Not just compete, win. Dominate. The Army was specific about what they wanted: heavy armament, high speed, high-altitude capability, and enough range to escort bombers deep into enemy territory. Kartvel's solution was radical, even shocking. Instead of designing a lightweight, agile dogfighter in the European tradition, he took the opposite approach. He would design his entire aircraft around the most powerful engine he could find, then build everything else to support that engine and its systems. The engine would dictate the design, not the other way around. The engine he chose was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an absolute monster of engineering. This was an 18-cylinder, two-row radial engine that produced a staggering 2,000 horsepower. To put that in perspective, that's more power than many modern cars. It was one of the most powerful aircraft engines in the world, and Kartvel's decided to build an entire fighter aircraft around it. But raw power wasn't enough. Kartvel's understood that future air combat would take place at high altitudes, above 25,000 feet, where the big American bombers would need protection. Up there, in the thin, freezing air, normal engines gasped and wheezed, losing power rapidly. Kartvel's weeded a way to maintain that engine's immense power at altitude. His solution was groundbreaking, a turbo-supercharger system. This required massive air ducting, complex plumbing, and a huge fuselage to house it all. When Kartvel's presented his preliminary designs to Republic's management and the Army Air Corps, the drawings showed an aircraft that looked positively pregnant, swollen with machinery. Kartvel's himself, with his characteristic dry wit, reportedly looked at his own design and said, "It will be a dinosaur, but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." Some accounts say he described it even more bluntly. "It looks like a flying milk bottle, but it will fly like a bat out of hell." And a dinosaur it absolutely was. The P-47 Thunderbolt weighed nearly 10,000 pounds empty, just the airframe, no fuel, no ammunition, no pilot. Fully loaded for a combat mission, it tipped the scales at over 17,000 pounds. 17,000 pounds! For comparison, the sleek, deadly Focke-Wulf FW-91, one of its main rivals and one of the finest fighters Germany ever produced, weighed less than 9,000 pounds, fully armed and fueled. This immense weight had immediate and deeply worrying consequences that became apparent the moment test pilots started flying the prototypes. The Thunderbolt's climb rate was poor, borderline unacceptable for a fighter. In a classic turning dogfight, the kind that veteran pilots were trained for, the kind that defined air combat from the First World War through the Battle of Britain, it was hopelessly, utterly outclassed. A Spitfire or an FW-91 could turn inside a P-47 all day long, getting on its tail and staying there, while the Thunderbolt pilot desperately tried to shake his attacker. It took forever to get off the ground. The P-47 needed long runways, really long runways, that weren't always available at forward airfields scattered across southern England. More than one pilot overran a runway during training, plowing through fences or hedgerows because the damn plane just wouldn't get airborne fast enough. On the ground, maintenance crews cursed it. It was big, heavy, difficult to work on. It required special equipment just to change a tire or access certain components. The sheer size meant it took up more hangar space, more parking space, more of everything. The Jug's actual combat debut on April 8, 1943, was not just disappointing, it was a complete disaster, an embarrassing fiasco. A fighter sweep over occupied France had to be called off, aborted before contact with the enemy, because the American VHF radios installed in the P-47s didn't work properly. They couldn't communicate with each other or with ground control. Imagine that! You've built this huge, expensive fighter aircraft, trained pilots to fly it, shipped everything across the Atlantic, and on its first combat mission, the radios don't work. It was a humbling setback that forced the entire P-47 fleet in England to be refitted with British radio equipment. The Germans, intercepting communications and receiving intelligence reports, must have laughed even harder. When P-47s finally did meet the enemy in earnest, when they finally got their chance to prove themselves, the results were grim. painful to read in the official records. In the first 2 months of combat operations, P-47 Thunderbolts flew over 2,000 combat missions. That's 2,000 times that American pilots strapped themselves into those big fighters and flew into hostile skies, their hearts pounding, knowing the Germans were waiting. In all those missions, they claimed only 10 German planes destroyed. 10! Meanwhile, they lost 18 of their own. 18 P-47s shot down, 18 pilots killed or captured. The kill-to-loss ratio was negative, a fighter pilot's nightmare. In air combat, you're supposed to kill more of them than they kill of you. That's how you win. The P-47 was losing. Luftwaffe pilots learned the playbook fast. They were professionals, after all, and they had years of experience analyzing enemy aircraft and developing countermeasures. The solution to the P-47 was simple. Get the clumsy American giant into a low-altitude turning fight, and it was an easy kill. Bounce them from above if possible, then drag them into a turning engagement below 10,000 feet. The P-47 would try to turn, fail, become predictable, and then you had them. Luftwaffe squadron intelligence officers updated their tactical briefings. The new American fighter is big and fast in a straight line at high altitude, but it cannot turn. Do not engage in head-on passes where their heavy firepower is an advantage. Force them to turn. Once committed to a turning fight, they are vulnerable. Standard victory procedures apply. The flying milk bottle seemed to be just what they thought. An oversized, underperforming flop, the product of American industrial excess meeting aviation incompetence. Even American pilots began to lose faith. The veterans of the 4th Fighter Group, many of whom were actually former RAF Eagle Squadron pilots, Americans who'd volunteered to fight for Britain before Pearl Harbor, bitterly, vocally missed their Spitfires. Some openly said they'd been betrayed, that the Army had taken away a perfect fighter and replaced it with a pig. Morale was low. Confidence was shaken. There were discussions, some serious, about simply abandoning the P-47 program in Europe and switching back to British aircraft, or waiting for other American designs that were in development. The Germans watched the arrival of this behemoth, not with fear, not with concern, but with arrogance and a kind of vindicated satisfaction. They saw a plane built with brute force in mind, typical American thinking, lacking the tactical finesse, the elegance, the engineering sophistication they prided themselves on. They saw it as proof that Americans just thought bigger was always better, that you could compensate for lack of skill with sheer mass. It was a philosophy they were absolutely sure would fail, because it had to fail. Their worldview required it to fail. The laughter in Luftwaffe mess halls was genuine, frequent, and confident. They'd faced the best the Allies had. They'd fought the Spitfire to a standstill over Britain. They'd smashed Soviet air power on the Eastern Front. They'd dominated the Mediterranean skies. And this American challenge, this P-47 Thunderbolt, this wasn't a threat. This was gift. This was target practice. But what they failed to grasp, what their arrogance and their conventional thinking prevented them from seeing, was that the P-47 wasn't designed for their kind of fight. It wasn't built to play their game by their rules. It was designed for a whole new kind of war, a new paradigm of air combat that was about to render their tactics, their experience, their accumulated wisdom obsolete. And the joke they would soon discover was on them. So why were the Germans so catastrophically wrong? Why did experienced combat pilots, men who'd survived years of the most dangerous flying imaginable, completely misjudge this aircraft? Because they were judging the Thunderbolt by their own standards, measuring it with their own ruler, failing to look deeper and see the revolutionary heart of the beast. The P-47's secrets weren't in its agility or its looks or its weight.
Its secrets were in its engine and the incredible, almost magical system that fed it, a system that allowed it to dominate where it mattered most, where the war was actually being decided, the frigid, thin air above 25,000 feet. Let's talk about the first secret, the engine itself, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. This wasn't just an engine. This wasn't just a mechanical device that converted fuel into motion. This was a 2,000-horsepower monument to American engineering capability, a masterpiece of metallurgy and design that would eventually be pushed with water methanol injection systems to over 2,800 horsepower. For comparison, and this comparison is crucial to understanding the P-47's dominance, the superb Daimler-Benz DB605 engine that powered the legendary Messerschmitt Bf109G produced around 1,400 to 1,800 horsepower, depending on the variant and boost settings. The BMW 801 that powered the FW190 produced about 1,700 horsepower. These were excellent engines, sophisticated, well-designed, proven in combat. The R2800 produced 2,000 to 2,800 horsepower. The difference was staggering, like comparing a sports car to a freight train. The R2800 was, simply put, without exaggeration, one of the most powerful and reliable piston engines of the entire war, and certainly one of the most successful aircraft engines ever built, powering not just the P-47, but also aircraft like the F-6F Hellcat, the F-4U Corsair, and eventually even large transports and bombers. But the real genius of the R2800 in the P-47 wasn't just the horsepower. It was the design philosophy, air-cooled radio configuration. The engine's cylinders were arranged in a circle around the crankshaft, like numbers on a clock face, in 2 rows of 9 cylinders each. This created more frontal area than an inline engine, which meant more drag, which is why the P-47 had that bulky, pregnant-looking shape. But, and this is critical, it also meant there was no fragile, vulnerable, complex liquid cooling system, no long tubes carrying precious coolant from the engine to radiators and back, no delicate pumps that could fail, no radiator that could be punctured by a single rifle-caliber bullet. German pilots, experienced, skilled, deadly German pilots, were absolutely used to exploiting this weakness in Allied fighters. They knew that the Spitfire's glycol cooling system was its Achilles heel. Hit the cooling system with your cannon shells, sever a coolant line, and watch the beautiful Spitfire's engine overheat in minutes. Watch the temperature gauge climb into the red. Watch the white stream of glycol coolant vaporizing behind the dying plane. Watch it fall from the sky, powerless, its pilot desperately scanning for a place to crash land or preparing to bail out. The same tactic worked on the Bf-109 actually, which was also liquid-cooled. German pilots knew their own plane's weakness. One good hit to the cooling system and you were done, finished, your engine cooking itself to death while you glided toward Earth hoping to reach friendly territory. The R2800, however, was a completely different animal, a different species entirely. It was air-cooled. The cylinders were cooled by the slipstream of air flowing over them, channeled by carefully designed baffles. There was no liquid to leak, no system to fail. And its sheer mass, its heavy construction, the robust design of every component meant it could absorb an unbelievable, almost impossible amount of battle damage. There are countless stories, documented, verified stories with photographs and official reports of P-47s returning to base with entire cylinders shot clean off, not damaged, not leaking, completely destroyed, blown away by cannon fire, missing, gone, and the engines still running, still producing power, still pulling the aircraft through the sky. The remaining cylinders would compensate, running rough, vibrating like a paint shaker, but running. There were reports of P-47s landing with 3, 4, 5 cylinders destroyed, and the pilot not even realizing how badly damaged the engine was until he shut down and the maintenance crew came running with pale faces. This wasn't luck. This was engineering. This was design philosophy made manifest. But even a powerful, durable engine alone wasn't enough to win the air war. The problem was altitude. At high altitudes, the air gets thin, there's less oxygen. An engine is basically an air pump that burns fuel. Less air means less oxygen, means less combustion, means less power. Most fighters of the era used a mechanical supercharger, a gear-driven compressor spun directly by the engine through gears or a shaft. The supercharger compressed the thin air at altitude, squeezing it back to sea-level density, allowing the engine to maintain power. This worked. It was a proven solution. Every major fighter used it. But there was a cost. The mechanical supercharger was a parasite. It was driven by the engine, which meant it was constantly stealing power that otherwise could go to the propeller. At low altitude, where the air was already dense, the supercharger was wasting energy compressing already thick air. At high altitude, the gear ratios were often wrong, or the supercharger simply couldn't compress enough air, and performance dropped off dramatically. Most fighters saw their performance peak around 15 to 20,000 feet, then fall off rapidly above that. This is where the Thunderbolt's true secret weapon came in, the General Electric turbo-supercharger, one of the most sophisticated pieces of equipment fitted to any World War II aircraft fighter. Instead of being driven by the engine mechanically, the turbo-supercharger was powered by the engine's own hot exhaust gases, waste energy that would otherwise be thrown away, vented into the atmosphere. This was brilliant, elegant, almost too good to be true. Here's how it worked. A mind-bogglingly complex network of exhaust ducts snaked from the engine cylinders down the belly of the plane through carefully designed passages to a turbine mounted in the rear fuselage. This turbine was essentially a windmill that was spun by the hot, high-velocity exhaust gases screaming past it at tremendous speed. The turbine was connected to a compressor. As the turbine spun, and it spun incredibly fast, over 20,000 RPM, faster than the engine itself, it drove the compressor, which scooped up thin, cold air from the atmosphere, pressurized it, and forced it back into the carburetor and then into the engine cylinders. The system was automatic, controlled by a complex regulator system that adjusted boost pressure based on altitude. The pilot had a control in the cockpit, essentially a throttle for the turbo, but much of the management was handled by mechanical regulators. The result was nothing short of miraculous. It was like giving the engine artificial lungs that grew stronger as the air got thinner. While German fighters with their mechanical superchargers began to gasp for air, struggling above 25,000 feet, their engines losing power, their performance degrading, the P-47's R-2800 with its turbo-supercharger was just hitting its stride. The turbo allowed the Thunderbolt to maintain its immense power, that full 2,000-plus horsepower, all the way up to 30,000 feet and beyond. Test pilots took P-47s to 40,000 feet. The plane was still responsive up there, in air so thin you could barely breathe, even with an oxygen mask, in temperatures so cold that frost formed on the inside of the canopy. Up there, in the realm of the high-altitude bombers it was built to protect, in the stratosphere where the B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators flew their missions into the heart of Nazi Germany, the clumsy Jug became a thoroughbred. It was fast, really fast. It was responsive. It was packed with energy, with potential energy that could be converted into speed or altitude or maneuverability at the pilot's will. German fighters could reach those altitudes, technically. A Bf-109G could climb to 30,000 feet if you gave it enough time. But up there, it was wheezing. It was slow. It was wallowing. Its engine was producing maybe 60% of its sea-level power. Its controls were mushy. It was operating at the edge of its performance envelope, struggling. The P-47, meanwhile, was in its element. It was comfortable up there. It was designed for that environment.
The Luftwaffe aces, with all their experience and skill, were being drawn into a new battlefield where all their hard-won advantages were stripped away. The flying milk bottle was revealing its first terrifying secret. It wasn't built to dance at low altitude. It was built to hunt in an environment where nothing else could breathe. And once it was up there looking down at you, you were in trouble. Serious trouble. If the P-47's engine was its heart, then its armament was its soul, the expression of its purpose, the reason for its existence. The cockpit was protected by armor plating that, when you looked at the technical drawings, resembled a bathtub, thick steel plates in front, behind, below, surrounding the pilot in a shell of protection. The windscreen was bulletproof glass, thick enough to stop rifle bullets and shell fragments. The canopy framing was armored. The air-cooled radial engine, as we've discussed, could absorb hits that would have vaporized a liquid-cooled engine. And critically, the plane's sheer size meant that enemy rounds could often pass straight through the fuselage without hitting anything vital. A 20mm cannon shell that would obliterate a small fighter might pass through a P-47's wing in one side and out the other, hitting only empty space or non-critical structure. The stories of the P-47's durability are legendary, passed down through pilot reunions and history books. But the most famous, the most documented, the most absolutely incredible story is that of Major Robert S. Johnson. June 26, 1943, a bright, clear day over France. Major Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group is flying his P-47 as part of an escort mission for American bombers. Johnson is already an experienced pilot, already an ace with several confirmed kills. Without warning, he's bounced, ambushed from above by Focke-Wulf FW-190s that dive out of the sun. He never sees them coming until it's too late. The Germans have executed a perfect attack. The first burst of cannon fire hits his aircraft, then another and another. Johnson's P-47 is shredded by at least 21 20mm cannon shells. That's the count he and the maintenance crew would later make from the holes, plus hundreds of machine gun rounds. 21 cannon shells. Each one carries explosive filler that detonates on impact. His canopy is shattered. Plexiglass fragments fill the cockpit like a blizzard. The instrument panel explodes. Shrapnel tears through the fuselage. Johnson himself is wounded. Fragments lacerate his leg and arm. He can taste blood in his mouth. The plane is on fire. Flames are licking back from the engine cowling, fed by ruptured fuel lines and hydraulic fluid. Johnson can feel the heat through his boots. He knows he's dead. There's no saving this. The procedure is clear. Bail out. Get out of the burning aircraft before it explodes or breaks apart. He reaches for the canopy release to jettison what's left of the shattered canopy so he can climb out. The mechanism is jammed. The damaged, twisted canopy frame won't release. He pulls harder, panic starting to set in. Nothing. It's stuck fast, twisted by the damage, the metal deformed. He tries to stand up in the cockpit, tries to force the canopy open with his shoulders and back. It won't budge. He's trapped. Trapped inside a burning aircraft that's falling out of control. Johnson makes a decision born of pure desperation. If he can't get out, maybe he can put out the fire. He pushes the control stick forward violently, putting the P-47 into a steep, near-vertical dive. The theory is simple. The increased airspeed and the angle might blow out the flames. It's insane. It might also rip the wings off the damaged plane, but it's his only chance. The P-47 plummets. The airspeed indicator needle sweeps past 400, past 450, past 500 miles per hour. The plane is shaking itself apart, rivets straining, the whole airframe screaming in protest.
And miraculously, impossibly, the flames go out. The sheer force of the air snuffs them like candles. Johnson pulls back on the stick, hauling the heavy fighter out of the dive, the G-forces crushing him into his seat, his vision narrowing to a tunnel, gray out threatening to become blackout. The plane levels off. It's still flying, barely. The engine is running rough, clattering and banging, but it's running. Johnson can hardly believe it. He's alive. He's still airborne. He turns west, toward the English Channel, toward safety, toward home. But his ordeal isn't over. A lone Focke-Wulf FW-190, one of the aircraft that had attacked him, spots the crippled Thunderbolt and moves in for the kill. The German pilot can't believe this plane is still airborne, but he's not going to let it escape. Johnson tries to fight back. He reaches for the gun trigger. Nothing. The electrical system is dead. The guns won't fire. He's helpless. The FW-190 makes a pass. Johnson can only sit there, waiting for the end, watching the German fighter line up behind him. He can see the flashes as the German opens fire. He feels the impacts as more rounds hit his already destroyed aircraft. How is it still flying? The FW-190 makes another pass, and another. The German pilot is methodical, professional, making textbook attacks. Each time, more rounds tear into the P-47. Johnson watches pieces of his aircraft fly off, bits of cowling, parts of the wing, chunks of the tail. Finally, after several passes, the FW-190 pulls up alongside Johnson's crippled plane. The two aircraft are flying almost side by side now, close enough that Johnson can clearly see the German pilot in his cockpit, can see his face. They make eye contact, pilot to pilot, warrior to warrior. The German pilot is out of ammunition. He spent everything trying to finish off this impossibly stubborn American aircraft, and it's still flying. The German pilot looks at Johnson, at this man who should be dead 10 times over, who's sitting in the ruins of an aircraft that has no right to be airborne, and slowly, deliberately, he rocks his wings. It's a salute. A gesture of respect, recognition of courage, of incredible luck, of something beyond normal combat. He's saluting a man he believes is already a ghost, already dead, just too stubborn to realize it. Then the FW-190 turns and heads east, back toward German-controlled airspace, leaving Johnson alone in the sky. Johnson somehow, through a combination of skill, determination, and that incredibly tough P-47, flies that wreck back across the English Channel. He lands at his home base in England. The aircraft is barely recognizable. The maintenance crew counts over 200 holes. 200! The aircraft is surveyed and officially written off, too damaged to repair, designated for the scrap heap. But Johnson is alive, and that P-47, that flying fortress, that absolute tank of an aircraft, brought him home. This wasn't a unique incident. It was extreme, yes, but it wasn't alone. There are dozens of similar stories. P-47s landing with engines barely attached, with control surfaces shot away, with fuel tanks that were nothing but Swiss cheese, with pilots who couldn't believe they were still alive. This was the Thunderbolt's second revelation. It wasn't just an engine and guns. It was a fortress. It was armor. It was protection. Luftwaffe pilots, used to seeing their targets disintegrate under cannon fire, now faced an enemy that simply refused to die. They'd pour ammunition into the giant American fighter, ammunition they couldn't afford to waste, watching their tracers stitching across the fuselage and wings, seeing the impacts, knowing they were hitting, and then watching in disbelief, in frustration, in growing fear, as it stubbornly flew on, as it returned fire, as it refused to go down. As Luftwaffe ace Heinz Baer, who scored 220 kills and was only one of a few to survive the entire war, famously said in a post-war interview, the P-47 could absorb an astounding amount of lead. You could hit it, and the damn thing would just keep flying. It was extremely difficult to bring down. After a while, we learned to avoid them if possible. The laughter was gone. completely gone. In its place was a growing sense of dread, of facing something beyond normal parameters. They were fighting a monster. But all this potential, the power, the firepower, the durability, was a weapon waiting for the right tactics. The early fumbles, the poor kill ratios, the American pilot complaints were all the result of pilots trying to fight the Luftwaffe's game by the Luftwaffe's rules, a deadly mistake that cost lives and aircraft.
German pilots, used to a balanced philosophy of firepower and ammunition conservation, were about to meet an aircraft built on a uniquely, quintessentially American principle: overwhelming, unadulterated, absolutely excessive firepower. The Thunderbolt carried a staggering 8 50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing. Let me repeat that because the number doesn't fully convey the reality. 8 guns. 8! Most fighters carried 4 guns, maybe 6. The Spitfire carried 8 machine guns in early versions, but they were rifle-caliber .303s, essentially the same as infantry rifles, fast-firing but lacking punch. Later Spitfires went to 2 20mm cannons and 4 machine guns, more punch, less rate of fire. The P-47 had 8 50-caliber Brownings. These weren't rifle-caliber pop guns. The 50-caliber Browning M2 was, and remains, one of the most successful machine gun designs ever created. Each gun fired a half-inch diameter bullet weighing almost 2 ounces, a massive, heavy slug propelled at almost 3,000 feet per second. These rounds could punch through armor plate, they could shatter engine blocks, they could saw through aluminum airframes like a chainsaw through plywood. Each gun fired at about 800 rounds per minute. Do the math. 8 guns times 800 rounds per minute equals 6,400 rounds per minute. That's over 100 rounds every single second. This wasn't just a lot of guns. This was a flying artillery battery. This was industrial-scale violence. Pilots who survived flying the P-47 in combat didn't describe it as firing guns. That phrase was too small, too inadequate. They said it felt like projecting a wall of lead. They said when you pressed the trigger, a button on the control stick, the entire aircraft shuddered. The noise was deafening even over the roar of the engine. The smell of cordite and gun oil filled the cockpit. Tracers, every 5th round was a tracer for aiming, streamed out from the wings like laser beams in a science fiction movie. And the ammunition load was just as massive, up to 4,000 rounds total, 500 rounds per gun. A Bf-109, by contrast, could exhaust its ammunition in just a few short bursts, maybe 15 seconds of total firing time if you held the trigger down continuously. Then you were flying an unarmed aircraft in the middle of a combat zone. A Thunderbolt pilot could hold down the trigger for nearly 30 seconds of continuous fire. 30 seconds doesn't sound like much, but in air combat, where engagements are measured in seconds and firing opportunities last for heartbeats, 30 seconds is an eternity. You didn't have to be a perfect shot. You didn't need to be a sniper. You just had to get the enemy somewhere in your sights, not even perfectly centered, just in the general vicinity, and then you squeezed the trigger and let the sheer volume of fire do the rest. The 8 guns were carefully aligned and harmonized to converge at a specific distance, often around 300 yards, the optimal firing range. At that distance, all 8 streams of bullets would intersect at a point. Anything caught in that zone, a wing, a cockpit, an engine nacelle, a tail assembly, would be utterly, completely shredded. It would essentially cease to exist as a functional structure. The heavy, high-velocity 50-caliber slugs hitting with combined force would disintegrate components. Luftwaffe ace Günter Röhl, one of the highest-scoring German aces with 275 victories, who survived the war and later became a general in the West German Air Force, described facing a P-47's firepower in his memoirs. He called it industrial execution. He said it changed air combat fundamentally. It no longer was a skilled duel between knights of the air. It became an act of industrial annihilation. If a P-47 got you in its sights, even for 2 seconds, you were finished. This overwhelming firepower was mounted on an airframe that could take a terrifying, almost unbelievable amount of punishment. The P-47 was, without exaggeration or hyperbole, one of the toughest combat aircraft ever built in the history of aviation. Its durability became legendary, the stuff of myths that were actually true. But a new generation of shrewd, innovative commanders began to realize the truth. Officers like Colonel Hubert Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group, like Colonel Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group, these men looked at the P-47's characteristics objectively and realized, you don't send a heavyweight boxer to dance ballet. You don't ask a linebacker to run a 100-meter sprint. You teach him to use his power, his mass, his strength where it matters. The answer was a tactic that was brutally simple, devastatingly effective, and as American as the plane itself. Boom and zoom. The doctrine, once understood, was elegantly straightforward. Avoid turning dogfights at all costs. Never ever let yourself get drawn into a low-altitude turning engagement with a German fighter. That's their game. They'll win. Instead, you use what you have. Altitude performance, speed, power, firepower. Here's how it worked in practice. P-47 pilots would use their engine's phenomenal high-altitude performance, that turbo-supercharger earning its keep, to climb above their opponents, way above. They'd take their time, climbing to 28, 29, 30,000 feet, or even higher if the mission profile allowed. From this perch, this commanding height advantage, they would scan the skies below for German fighters. The visibility from 30,000 feet is incredible on a clear day. You can see for 100 miles. You can see the curve of the Earth. And down below, you can see everything. Bombers, fighters, contrails, the patterns of aircraft, the development of combat. Once a target was spotted, a German fighter formation or even a single enemy aircraft, the P-47 pilot would position himself carefully, using the sun if possible, thinking about angles and geometry, and then he would tip his aircraft over and dive. And in a dive, the P-47 Thunderbolt was absolutely, completely untouchable. It was unstoppable. It was a force of nature. The immense weight that was such a curse in a climb became its greatest asset in a dive. Gravity grabbed that 8-ton fighter and pulled it down with terrifying, accelerating force. The P-47 could reach speeds in a dive that would literally tear the wings off other aircraft, speeds that exceeded structural limits of German fighters. Pilots pushed well over 500 miles per hour in a dive. Some test pilots pushed to 600. The control surfaces would stiffen, compressibility effects as they approached the speed of sound, but the plane held together. The massive structure, the thick wings, the overbuilt construction that made it so heavy now kept it from breaking apart. At these velocities, the P-47 became a guided missile, a meteor with a pilot and guns. The attack was swift, violent, and devastating. A P-47 would plummet out of the sun. The sun was important. It blinded your target, prevented them from seeing you coming. Its target often completely unaware until the very last second, until the sky suddenly erupted in tracers, in the distinctive sound of 8 50 calibers all firing at once, a sound like tearing canvas amplified 1,000 times. The pilot had just a few seconds to line up a shot. At closure rates of hundreds of miles per hour, the window was tiny. He'd squeeze the trigger, feel the aircraft shudder, watch his tracers converge, see the impacts, see pieces fly off the enemy aircraft. And then, before the target could react, before his wingmen could respond, before defensive fire could be brought to bear, the Thunderbolt would be passed, using its incredible speed to zoom climb back to altitude, trading speed for height, the momentum of the dive carrying it back up to its perch, ready for another pass. There was no duel, no graceful exchange, no knights circling each other with honor. It was a high-speed execution. It was brutal, effective, unsporting, and absolutely deadly. This tactical shift transformed the P-47's effectiveness almost overnight. Within months, kill ratios improved dramatically. By late 1943, P-47 units were consistently destroying more German aircraft than they lost. The bomber escorts, which had been a source of anxiety, became effective. The P-47 became the premier escort fighter for the B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators of the 8th Air Force, flying daylight missions into Germany. Now, German fighters had to fight their way through a ceiling of prowling Thunderbolts, circling at altitude like predatory birds, just to get near the bombers. And if they committed to attacking the bombers, the P-47s would pounce, diving down with overwhelming speed and firepower. By late 1943, German intelligence reports, Luftwaffe intelligence officers who compiled assessments of Allied aircraft, which had initially dismissed the P-47 as clumsy and inferior, now identified it as a deadly threat, a priority target, an aircraft to be respected and feared. The aircraft itself was also evolving, improving as field experience in engineering developments addressed early shortcomings. One of the most significant upgrades was the bubble canopy. The original P-47 had what was called a razorback design. A solid, raised spine ran from behind the pilot's head back to the tail. It looked robust, it added structural strength, but it had a fatal flaw, a huge blind spot to the rear. A pilot couldn't see directly behind him. In air combat, where most kills come from behind, where the phrase "check your six," meaning check behind you, the 6 o'clock position, can mean the difference between life and death, this was unacceptable. Republic Aviation responded with a new teardrop-shaped bubble canopy. It was clear all around, giving the pilot an unobstructed 360-degree view. You could look over your shoulder and see directly behind you. You could look up and see aircraft above. The situational awareness improved dramatically, literally life-saving. Another game-changer was the new paddle blade propeller, also called the wide blade or fan propeller. The original propellers had relatively narrow blades. They worked, but they weren't efficiently converting all that engine power into thrust, especially at low speeds and low altitudes. The new paddle blade propeller had wider blades with a more aggressive shape. They bit into the air more effectively, like using a bigger paddle in the water. The improvement in takeoff performance was immediately noticeable. Shorter takeoff rolls, faster acceleration, climb rate improved significantly, and most importantly, the P-47's rate of climb, which had been its biggest weakness, improved dramatically. The sluggish jug the German pilots had once mocked, the plane that couldn't climb to save its life, could now climb right along with them. Not quite as well as a Bf-110 or FW-190 in a sustained climb, but well enough that it wasn't the sitting duck it had been. With these improvements, the bubble canopy, the paddle blade prop, refined tactics, experienced pilots, the P-47 became a truly formidable fighter, a complete weapons system. It had the visibility to see threats. It had the climb rate to get to altitude. It had the speed to chase down or escape from anything. It had the firepower to destroy anything it hit. It had the durability to bring its pilot home even when damaged. And it had pilots who understood how to use all of these advantages. The days of laughing at the flying milk bottle were a distant, bitter memory for Luftwaffe pilots. Now, when they looked up during a mission and saw those distinctive bulky silhouettes circling high above, black specks against the blue sky at impossible altitude, they felt a cold knot of fear forming in their guts. The sky was no longer theirs. They were the hunted now. As 1944 dawned, another American fighter began arriving in Europe, the North American P-51 Mustang. The Mustang, in many ways, was everything the P-47 wasn't. It was sleek, elegant, beautiful, and most importantly, it had phenomenal range. With external drop tanks, a P-51 could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, something the P-47, despite its size, couldn't quite do. The P-47's thirsty R-2800 engine, for all its power, drank fuel at an enormous rate. For a lesser aircraft, this might have meant obsolescence, replacement, retirement. The Army might have phased out P-47 production, concentrated on the P-51, and relegated existing Thunderbolts to training units. But for the Thunderbolt, it was the beginning of a second life, a new calling where its particular talents for destruction would be unleashed with even greater ferocity than in air-to-air combat. The role, fighter-bomber, or as the Germans came to call it, speaking the word with horror and dread, the Jabo, short for Jagdbomber, hunter-bomber. The P-47's powerful engine, that massive R-2800 that gave it such incredible high-altitude performance, had another benefit. It could haul an enormous payload. The plane was strong, the wings were thick and robust, the structure was overbuilt. Republic Aviation and Army engineers realized the P-47 could carry bombs, a lot of bombs, up to 2,500 pounds of bombs, a load that rivaled some light bombers like the A-20 Havoc or the A-26 Invader. Plus, it could carry an array of up to 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, HVARs. Each HVAR had
The P-47, with its new ground attack capability, was the perfect tool for this job. And the pilots, who'd spent months learning to be fighter pilots, now had to learn a new trade: how to drop bombs, how to fire rockets, how to strafe ground targets. The effect was absolutely cataclysmic. Flying at treetop level, sometimes literally below tree level, following river valleys and roads, terrain rasked to avoid radar, P-47s roamed across France like packs of predators hunting anything that moved. Their targets were the arteries of the German army, the logistics network that kept a modern mechanized military functioning, railways, supply depots, troop convoys, fuel dumps, ammunition storage, bridges, rail yards, marshalling areas, airfields, radar stations, command posts. A flight of 4 Thunderbolts could appear in seconds, materializing out of the morning mist or afternoon haze, their engines roaring, and in those seconds they could destroy a target that represented months of German effort. Their 850 caliber machine guns could rip a column of trucks into a chain of burning wrecks. Each truck might carry ammunition, fuel, food, spare parts, essential supplies for frontline units. Destroy the trucks and you starve the front line. Their rockets could obliterate a tank. The German Panther and Tiger tanks, which were nearly invulnerable from the front against most Allied tank guns, could be destroyed from above by a well-placed rocket. The top armor was much thinner. Their bombs could crater airfields, making them unusable for days or weeks. They could destroy bridges, forcing German engineers to spend precious time and resources building pontoon bridges or finding alternate routes. It was in this role, low-level ground attack, that the P-47's legendary toughness became its most vital, most life-saving asset. Low-level attack is the most dangerous flying in combat. You're flying at 300, 400 miles per hour, at 50 feet or 100 feet altitude, straight and level to line up your target, completely exposed to ground fire, and everyone is shooting at you. infantry with rifles, machine gun nests, light flak guns, 20mm, 37mm, 40mm cannons designed specifically to kill aircraft, heavy flak if you're near a valuable target, even pistols. German soldiers would empty their pistols at attacking aircraft out of defiance and desperation. You're flying directly into a blizzard of lead and steel and explosive shells. Most aircraft would be torn to pieces. A single hit to an engine, a fuel tank, a control surface, and you're going down. But the Thunderbolt's rugged airframe and air-cooled engine could soak it up and keep flying. P-47s would routinely return to base riddled with holes, trailing smoke, hydraulic fluid streaming, one or more cylinders destroyed, control cables severed and flying on the backup cables, and their pilots were alive, shaken but alive. As one common saying went among P-47 pilots, repeated in ready rooms across England and France, there isn't a P-47 pilot alive who wouldn't elect to belly one in rather than bail out, meaning if your plane was damaged, you could trust it to bring you home. You could trust it to survive a crash landing. Don't bail out over enemy territory and become a prisoner of war. Stay with the plane. It'll protect you. D-Day and beyond. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, and in the brutal, grinding weeks that followed as Allied forces fought to break out of the Normandy beachhead, the P-47 Thunderbolt became the German soldiers' worst nightmare. The Allies had total air superiority. The Luftwaffe was largely absent, overwhelmed, out of fuel, outmatched. The skies belonged to the Allies, and the P-47s owned the ground attack mission. German tank commanders, who had once ruled the battlefield with their Panthers and Tigers, who had terrorized Allied forces in North Africa and Russia, were now paralyzed. Moving during daylight hours invited swift and violent death from above. Entire tank columns would be forced to hide under trees during the day, camouflaged with branches and nets, waiting for darkness before they could move. The distinctive roar of the R-2800 engine, that deep, powerful throb that you could feel in your chest, became a sound of impending doom. German soldiers developed what they called jabbo fever, a form of combat stress caused by constant air attack. When the sound of a thunderbolt was heard, soldiers would panic, diving for cover, abandoning their vehicles, scrambling into ditches and buildings, knowing that death was only seconds away. The psychological impact was immense. It wasn't just the actual casualties, though those were significant. It was the constant threat, the knowledge that at any moment, without warning, the jabbos could appear and you would die in fire and high explosives. The statistics from D-Day to VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, May 8, 1945, are absolutely staggering, almost hard to comprehend in their scale. P-47 pilots would go on to claim the destruction of 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, including tanks and self-propelled guns, 68,000 trucks, and hundreds of bridges, factories, and other infrastructure targets. These aren't just numbers. Each destroyed truck was supplies that never reached the front line. Each destroyed locomotive was a train that couldn't move troops or ammunition. Each destroyed tank was a weapon that couldn't be used against Allied soldiers. The P-47s systematically dismantled the German logistical network, starving the front lines, creating a collapse that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the German commander-in-chief in the West, one of Germany's most experienced and capable military leaders, bitterly complained in his reports to Berlin. Allied air power, led by the Jabbos, had made it impossible to conduct any meaningful troop movements during daylight hours. The German army's mobility, its ability to respond to threats, to concentrate forces, to counterattack, all the things that had made the Wehrmacht so effective in 1939 through 1942 had been completely negated. The joke had become a juggernaut.
The story of the P-47's victory isn't just about technology or tactics or brave pilots, though all of those played crucial roles. It's fundamentally the story of a clash between two totally different philosophies of war, two different approaches to military power. The German approach, refined through years of military tradition, relied on a core of highly skilled, intensely trained, irreplaceable aces. The Luftwaffe cultivated its top pilots like precious resources. They accumulated victory tallies in the dozens, the hundreds. Names like Hartmann, Rahl, Barkhorn, Marseille became legendary. These men were heroes, celebrated in propaganda, awarded medals, given the best equipment. But they were finite. There were only so many of them, and when they were lost, killed, injured, captured, they couldn't be replaced. You can't create an ace overnight. It takes years of training, combat experience, survival, talent, and luck. The American approach was fundamentally different. It was industrial. It was about overwhelming force, mass production, standardization, the assembly line applied to warfare. The P-47 was the perfect symbol of this doctrine, and the sheer number of Thunderbolts produced is almost hard to comprehend. Between 1941 and 1945, Republic Aviation's factories, primarily in Farmingdale, New York, and Evansville, Indiana, churned out 15,600 P-47 Thunderbolts. 15,600! At peak production, mid-1944, a new Thunderbolt was rolling off the assembly line, completed, tested, and ready to fly every single hour, every hour of every day. 24 aircraft per day, 7 days a week. This was an industrial tsunami, a wave of steel and aluminum that the German war machine simply could not counter, could not match, could not even comprehend. While German factories struggled under constant Allied bombing, under shortages of aluminum and steel and rubber and fuel, trying desperately to produce a few hundred fighters per month, sometimes succeeding, sometimes falling short, America was burying them under an avalanche of aircraft. And this miracle of production extended to every part of the plane. Over 125,000 of the R-2800 engines were built during the war, not just from Pratt & Whitney, the original designer, but by automotive giants like Ford Motor Company and Chevrolet, companies that had been building cars and trucks and were converted to military production. This ensured a literally limitless supply of planes and spare parts. The logistics were staggering. Warehouses full of engines, propellers, landing gear, instruments, radios, guns. If a P-47 was damaged, even badly damaged, it could often be repaired and flying again in days, sometimes even hours. And the pilots themselves were another product of this industrial-scale approach. While the Luftwaffe's training program withered and died, fuel shortages meant fewer training flights. Experienced instructors were pulled back to combat units because they were desperately needed. Training was cut short because the front needed bodies. The U.S. Army Air Forces built a vast, comprehensive training pipeline that was one of the great unsung achievements of the war. Before an American pilot ever saw combat, before he ever flew over enemy territory, he received hundreds of hours of flight instruction. The training program started with ground school, aerodynamics, engines, navigation, meteorology, military law, physical fitness. Then primary training in light aircraft, learning to fly, basic maneuvers. Then basic training in more powerful aircraft. Then advanced training in actual combat types, P-47s, P-51s, P-38s. Then gunnery school, learning to shoot, deflection angles, air-to-air tactics. Then operational training, formation flying, navigation, mock combat. By the time an American pilot arrived at his combat unit in England or Italy or the Pacific, he typically had well over 200 hours of flight time. He knew his aircraft inside and out. He'd fired its guns. He'd practiced emergency procedures. He'd flown at night, in bad weather, in formation. In stark, tragic contrast, by late 1944 and early 1945, a new Luftwaffe pilot was lucky to have 100 hours of total flight time before being thrown into battle. Sometimes less, sometimes 50 hours. They barely knew how to fly their aircraft, let alone fight in it. They were sent up to face Allied pilots who had hundreds of hours and months of combat experience. It was slaughter. The Americans weren't just building more planes, they were building more pilots. Nearly 200,000 of them graduated from various aircrew training programs during the war. Pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, a vast army of airmen. The loss of a pilot, while always a tragedy, while mourned by his squadron mates, while representing a family back home receiving a terrible telegram, was strategically a replaceable loss. Another pilot would arrive next week. He'd be trained, competent, ready. The system would continue functioning. For the Luftwaffe, losing an experienced pilot was a catastrophe that rippled through the entire organization. The final piece of this industrial warfare puzzle was logistics, probably the most boring, most unglamorous, most underappreciated aspect of warfare, and also one of the most important. The P-47 was a thirsty machine. That R-2800 engine, generating immense power, burned fuel at an enormous rate. A typical combat mission might burn 300, 400, even 500 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel. The ammunition load, 4,000 rounds of .50 caliber, had to be replenished after every mission where the guns were fired. Oil, hydraulic fluid, oxygen for the pilot, replacement parts, tires, everything had to be supplied continuously. America's industrial might ensured that all of this, the fuel, the ammunition, the spare parts, the everything, was available in seemingly infinite quantities. Tanker ships carried fuel across the Atlantic. Freighters carried ammunition, parts, entire aircraft. Trucks distributed supplies from ports to forward airfields. Logistics units managed the flow, tracked inventory, ensured nothing ran out. German forces, by contrast, were slowly starving. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft, ammunition shortages limited combat missions, spare parts couldn't be obtained. The entire logistical system was collapsing under the weight of Allied strategic bombing and the sheer scale of the war. This was the war the Luftwaffe could never win. They weren't just fighting the P-47 Thunderbolt. They weren't just fighting skilled American pilots. They were fighting the entire industrial capacity of the United States of America. The factories, the training schools, the logistics network, the resources of a continent-sized nation fully mobilized for total war. The P-47 was the steel-tipped spear of a juggernaut that ground the Luftwaffe into dust through sheer, relentless, overwhelming attrition. By May 8, 1945, V-Day, victory in Europe, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had carved its name into history with blood and fire and determination. The plane once mocked as a flying milk bottle, dismissed as a clumsy joke, ridiculed by enemies and even by its own pilots, had become a legend. It ended the war with an official air-to-air kill-to-loss ratio of over 4-to-1. For every P-47 lost to enemy aircraft, over 4 German aircraft were destroyed. That's dominance. The total mission count was staggering. Over 500,000 combat missions flown. 534,000 according to official records. That's over 500,000 times that a pilot climbed into a P-47 and flew into harm's way. Thousands of enemy aircraft destroyed. Estimates range from 3,800 to over 5,000, depending on how you count flames versus confirmed kills, air victories versus ground strafing. Tens of thousands of ground targets destroyed. The statistics we mentioned earlier: 86,000 rail cars, 9,000 locomotives, 68,000 trucks, 6,000 armored vehicles, plus countless other targets.
But beyond the statistics, beyond the numbers, the P-47's journey from underdog to dominator was fundamentally a story of adaptation. It was about recognizing strengths and ruthlessly exploiting them. It was about developing tactics that matched capabilities rather than trying to force capabilities to match preconceived tactics. It was a story of technological innovation, harnessing the power of a revolutionary engine and its turbo-supercharger system to conquer the high-altitude frontier that would define modern air warfare. And above all, it was a story of industrial philosophy, a stark demonstration that wars between industrialized nations are won not just by tactical brilliance or strategic genius or even individual courage, though all of those matter, but by the relentless, overwhelming power of mass production, logistics, and resource mobilization. Perhaps the ultimate testament to the P-47's impact came from the Germans themselves, from the men who faced it and survived to tell the tale. Adolf Galland, Germany's general of fighters, one of the most influential and capable officers in the Luftwaffe, a man who'd been flying and fighting since the Spanish Civil War, was asked after the war what truly defeated the Luftwaffe. What was the turning point? When did you know you'd lost the air war? Galland didn't point to a single battle. He didn't mention the Battle of Britain or the introduction of the P-51 Mustang or any specific tactical defeat. He pointed to the sky over Germany in 1944 and 1945. He described looking up and seeing it darkened by swarms of American fighters, Thunderbolts, Mustangs, Lightnings, aircraft that could hunt his own pilots to extinction, that could escort bombers all the way to any target in Germany and back, that could strafe his airfields, that could attack his pilots during takeoff and landing when they were most vulnerable. He said the moment he knew Germany had lost was when the Luftwaffe could no longer protect German airspace, when American fighters roamed freely over the fatherland, when his pilots, no matter how skilled, no matter how brave, were overwhelmed by sheer numbers and industrial might. The P-47 was the brutal, primary instrument of that dominance. The P-47's legacy lives on. The design philosophy, a heavily armed, incredibly tough aircraft built to support ground troops, to absorb punishment and keep fighting, to be a flying tank, has a direct spiritual successor in the modern U.S. Air Force. The Fairchild Republic A-10 Thunderbolt II, better known by its nickname, the Warthog, carries on the Thunderbolt name and mission. It's built around a massive 30mm Gatling gun, just as the P-47 was built around its engine. It's heavily armored, designed to take hits and survive. It's a ground attack specialist. It's beloved by ground troops and feared by enemies. The parallels are intentional. The A-10 was explicitly named after the P-47 to honor that legacy. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is a perfect reversal of fortune. It begins with laughter, with mockery and dismissal and contempt. It ends with fear, with respect and dread, and the knowledge that you're facing something you can't defeat. It starts as a joke. It finishes as a juggernaut. It's a timeless reminder that in the deadly calculus of war, the most underestimated weapon can often become the most decisive, that conventional wisdom can be catastrophically wrong, that you should never judge a weapon by its appearance, but by its performance when it matters. The German pilots who laughed at the flying milk bottle in 1943 would spend the next 2 years learning that lesson, the ones who survived. The ones who didn't, and there were thousands who didn't, learned it too late. So here's my question for you. What would you have done if you were a Luftwaffe pilot in the summer of 1943, seeing this strange new American fighter